This week's is a double portion called Chukat and Balak, which means statue and Balak. I will tell you that there are 7 pairs of the Parshas that sometimes are combined to reconcile the number of Shabbat readings with the need to understand or complete the annual Torah cycle. To me, this double portion is the best. It has a great deal of teachings that can be wrapped up into them. Let's take a look at the structure of these Parshas. We're looking at Chukat Balak, which means statue, and Balak. You're going to find this listed in Numbers chapter 19, verse 1 to Numbers chapter 25, verse 9. In Chukat, you're going to find a Haftorah mentioned in Judges chapter 11, verses 1 to 33, and the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah. In the Brit Hadashah, it talks about John 3, verses 9 to 21, John 4, verses 3 to 30, and John 12, verses 27 to 50. And then we drop down into Balak, and we're going to be talking about Micah 5, verse 6 to 6, verse 8. Micah is the Haftorah for Balak. And then in the Brit Hadashah, you're looking at the process of 1 Corinthians 1, verses 20 to 31, 2 Peter 2, verses 1 to 22, Jude 11, and Revelations chapter 2, verse 14 to 15. Now, when you take a look at Chukat, you're going to find that we start with the Numbers chapter 19, verses 1 to 22, with the ashes of the red heifer. This process still exists today. They are trying to put together the red heifer for the rebuilding of the temple today. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 to 13, it talks about Moses striking of the rock. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 to 21, it talks about Edom refusing the passage and the Israelites having to take all the way around to be able to get into the promised land. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 22 to 29, it talks about the death of Aaron. Then we move into Numbers chapter 21, verses 1 to 3, where it deals with the war with Amalek and God's laying the law down for Amalek. In Numbers chapter 21, verses 4 to 9, it talks about the brass serpent. And in Numbers chapter 21, verses 10 to 20, it talks about the book of the wars of Hashem. And Numbers chapter 21, verses 21 to 30, it's the war with Sihon. And in Numbers chapter 21, it is Numbers chapter 21, verse 31 to Numbers 22, verse 1, it is the war with Og. Now, in Balak, that covers a lot of territory, but now in Balak, in Numbers chapter 22, verse 2 to 23, verse 6, it talks about Balak, whose name means destroyer or to lay waste. He tries to get Balaam to curse Israel. And in Numbers chapter 23, verses 7 to 10, Balaam's answer to Balak, no. In Numbers chapter 23, verses 13 to 30, it's the second attempt by Balak to get Balaam to curse Israel. In Numbers chapter 24, verses 1 to 8, Balaam gives oral sayings about Israel. Now we take a look at Numbers chapter 24, verse 9, and what Balaam is going to do is he is going to reiterate the Abrahamic covenant in that verse. And then we drop into Numbers chapter 24, verses 10 to 25, and it's Balaam's prophecy against the nations. And then we wind up going into Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 to 9. The end of this double portion is the historical narrative of how the Moabite women enticed Israel to sin. That is the total. Now let's take a look at a couple of questions with that information. Can a person follow the correct doctrine religiously and still be at odds with God? I mean, can you cut a deal with God by following the correct doctrine? Israel never knew they were in a battle. God did. What this portion is going to show is how very jealous God is over his people. It's also going to show how faithful he is to his covenant. And it will also show the uses of the number 7, the number 3, and is going to teach 8 principles of God-given principles. Now, with that, let's take a look at the first one with the number 7. The number 7 was of divine importance throughout all the known world at that time. Old Babylonian clay tablets had these words: set up 7 altars, 7 incense burners, and 7 sheep. The number 7 was also connected to the Hebrew religious event calendar. I mean, you got the 7 days, the 7 years, the 7th month, and the 7 sprinklings of blood on the altar of Holy of Holies. Now, after sacrificing on 7 altars, 7 oxen, 7 rams, 3 times, and in 3 separate places, Balak asked Balaam to perform the curse 3 times. And instead, Balaam blesses Israel 3 times. He's the first Gentile to bless Israel. And Balaam is going to prophesy a glorious future for Israel and a very strong prophecy against the nations that go up against it. Now let's take a look as it relates to the basis of the principles, the 8 principles that were given. There are 8 principles that were taught in this portion, and we call this the whole process of the 8, the false prophets principle. The 8 principles wrapped up into it, and here's why. Balaam shows that being inspired by God does not of itself indicate righteousness. I mean, pagan kings and prophets can at times foretell a future. Even Satan disguises himself as light. But the best protection is to know all of the Word of God, so you can better discern what you're being prophesied. Principle number 1. God is not a man that he would change. Principle number 2. The Lord will use man's free will to achieve his will. Next principle. A false prophet can at times be accurate. I mean, God will even use direct contact with that false prophet. Balaam could not see the angel of the Lord because he was spiritually blind. Another principle is that the evil one can appear as light and still be counterfeit. Another principle of this 8 principles is when our desires appear to be blocked, they may have a divine reason that's attached to it. The 7th principle is that the Lord has neither established nor permits magic and divination in Israel. Never. And the 8th principle is often a prophetic event happens twice, once and then again far into the future. Here is God moves in time. And I'm going to give you an example of God's movement in time. And that example is D-Day, June the 6th, 1943. Let me give you the facts. Number 1, Rommel, one of Hitler's greatest generals, was in charge of defending the French coastline. Fact number 2, 2 weeks before, Hitler removed Rommel's tank corps. He removed it from his command so that it was not available to the defense for the French coastline. Number 3, June the 5th weather was so bad, Rommel used the opportunity to return to Berlin and plead with Hitler for his tank corps. And number 4, June the 6th was his wife's 50th birthday, so he stayed in Berlin and was not even available during the invasion. How about number 5? The German second-in-command retired early on June the 5th with orders not to be disturbed for any reason. The 6th fact is that Hitler refused to believe the first intelligence reports from the invasion. He was convinced himself that it was going to come from Dunkirk. The 7th fact is that many of the best German generals had just been sent to the Russian front. Fact number 8. The German Air Corps was in training maneuvers south of France, and they did not become available until after the landing for which they were training was finished. And number 9, a strong gale wind of June the 5th stopped for only a couple hours the next day. And that is when the landing took place. Now, those are the facts. Let's answer some questions, okay? Who inspired Romno to choose precisely that day to return to Berlin to present his case to Hitler for the return of his K Corps? Question number 2. Who prompted Hitler to take the command of the Tank Corps away from Romno in the first place? Question number 3. Who brought into the world, 50 years earlier, a baby girl who would become Romno's wife and born on June the 6th? Question number 4. Who, in the mind of Romno's second in command, to give orders not to disturb him? Who put it in his mind? Another question. Who convinced Hitler to ignore the first reports of the invasion? Another question. Who led the German commanders to schedule war games for June the 5th to the 7th and leave only 2 planes to defend the entire coastline? And the last question we need to look at is, who created the break in the gale winds for a few hours on June the 6th, hours needed to land the men? It was God operating behind the scenes. Now, here's the point. Israel had no idea at this time that they were going to be cursed, yet God was again operating behind the scenes. You know, when I mention these names, what comes to mind? Wyatt Earp, Pat Masterson, Wild Bill Hickok, Balaam. Is it the term hired gun? Let's take a look at the concept of the hired gun. Basketball players today are a team, and yet they are just a bunch of collection of transit hired guns that move from team to team. It's the fans who are the ones who are loyal and has some concept of team identities. The players, with a few notable exceptions, are just in it as a business, but the body of the Messiah is not a business. When it comes to spiritual leadership and communicating the truth of God in a powerful way, hired guns have no place in the program of God. God raises up servant leaders, but he rebukes the hired guns. Let's take a look at the point of something. Now, most of you are not alive. They weren't even born at this particular point, but I was. And I enjoyed this program. Between 1957 and 1963, there was a program on TV called Have Gun, Will Travel. Now, the lead character was a man called Paladin. Now, Paladin was a very educated gunfighter who would hire out his gun, but it would be his choice. And he had one characteristic that did not fit the normal hired gun. He would turn on his employer if he found out that they were the guilty party. Now, with that concept, what are the attributes of the hired gun? Well, he's fearless and tough. I mean, nobody's going to make him quick in his boots. He has a reputation. And in Numbers chapter 22, verses 1 to 6, Balaam had a reputation. That means he's always in the demand. And it means also he has very impressive credentials. He's good at what he does. He's very competent because that's how he gets his reputation. Another attribute is he fulfills the mission. This is recorded in Numbers chapter 22, verse 36 to 24:9. This is the basis of Balaam. That means to fulfill the mission, he gets results. Why? Because there's no market for his services if word gets around that he's unable to deliver. His reputation depends on doing the job he was paid to. Another attribute is the fact that he's under contract. That means he will accept any assignment if the price is right. With that in mind, he had no loyalties. He must honor his contract, but it can be changed by the very next contract. And another attribute is this, and it's one of the strongest. A hired gun can still be used by God to deliver his message. This is recorded in Numbers chapter 24, verses 10 to 24, 25. Who said these words? God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? Those words were spoken by Balaam in Numbers chapter 23, 19. Consider this. The test of a prophet is not that he never says anything true, but it's that you can catch him in major falsehood. That means he predicts something that does not come to pass. Now, here is the most important attribute as it relates to the basis of the hired gun. The hired gun will ultimately lose in his shootout with God. You're going to find that in Numbers chapter 25 and Numbers chapter 21. Balaam had a problem. He could not curse Israel. So what he did was he came up with plan B. His counsel was on how to get around the problem that God was determined to bless Israel. His plan B was to win the wages of the unrighteousness worked. It worked. But he didn't get a chance to enjoy spending the money. Now, let's take a look at servant leader versus the hired gun, because there is a difference. The difference between the two is in question is motivation and integrity. Let's look at motivation. Are you driven by the desire to do the will of the master and to meet the needs of God's people? Or are you enticed by the amount of the wages and the praises of men? Now, when I make that statement, you don't misunderstand me. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not saying that because some spiritual leader makes a nice salary, he falls under the condemnation of a hired gun. That is not true. That is not what I'm saying, because we're talking about an attitude on this. To make this choice means you are judging the idea of the spiritual leader just because of what he made. We're talking about the attitude, okay? Now, the second process is integrity. We had motivation, integrity. Integrity means a soundness of moral principle and character. Answer this question. Are you loyal to God and to his people and to his moral will? Or are you loyal to your own selfish ambition and fleshly desires? Here's why. The hired gun is blinded to the heart of God. Now, how does this apply to us? Well, there are three categories of people we're going to look at. Number one, the Gentiles who want to learn about the Jewish roots, and the Jews who want to worship in their Jewish upbringing. Those are called sheep. And then you've got the servant leaders. They bring their love of God into the service. Those are called sheepdogs. But then there are those who have their own agenda. Those are called wolves. They are what you would call the hired gun. What they do is they follow the way of Balaam, the error of Balaam, and the doctrine of Balaam. Well, let's take a look at all three of these and start with the way of Balaam. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15, it says, "They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness." Are you walking in the way of Balaam? The way of Balaam was to prostitute his gift for financial reward. Money and prophecy do not mix. It is better to keep the issue of fee for service well away from the activity of prophecy. The dictionary defines soothsaying as the practice of divination for money. Now, in Numbers chapter 22, verse 7, it reads, "The elders of Moab took with them a fee for divination, and they came to Balaam and told him what Balak had requested." What that meant was Balaam sold out his prophetic gift for cash. Now, the way of Balaam is not just dangerous today as it was. It's just as dangerous today as it was during the time of Numbers chapter 22. People today have a fixed idea in their mind, and then they go to the Bible to seek to justify their actions. Here's the point. You cannot come before God with your own fixed plan. You cannot have some purpose or idea in mind and then come to the Bible to justify it. You cannot come to the Bible simply to prove a doctrine, because it will cause you to go contrary to much of what God requires of you. To believe a doctrine not found in the Bible, and then to come to the Bible to seek to prove it, will make that person dishonest. And if that is your approach, and I know what I'm talking about, if that is your approach, you will reject any passage which differs from your own preconceived idea, and that is extremely dangerous. Again, the question is, whether the way of Balaam, that's the next question. Are you walking in the error of Balaam? In Jude chapter 11, it says, "Woe to them! They have taken the way of Cain, they have rushed for profit into Balaam's error, and they have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion." Here's a good question. What was the error of Balaam that was serious enough to be included with Cain, who murdered his brother in Genesis chapter 4, as well as Korah, who led a rebellion against Moses that resulted in the death of many Israelites, as recorded in Numbers chapter 16? In the Bekeah vote, which is the ethics of the fathers, in vote 519, it contrasts Balaam's sins with Abraham's righteousness, and it says this: "Whosoever possesses the following three traits is of the disciples of our father Abraham, and whosoever possesses the opposite three traits is of the disciples of the wicked Balaam." The disciples of our father Abraham had a good eye, a meek spirit, and a humble soul. The disciples of wicked Balaam had an evil eye for greed and envy, a haughty spirit, and a gross soul. The disciples of our father Abraham benefit in this world and inherit the world to come, as it is stated, "To bequeath to those who love me there is, and their treasures I will fulfill." You'll find that in Proverbs chapter 8, verse 21. The disciples of wicked Balaam inherit purgatory and descend into the pit of destruction, as it is stated, "And you, God, shall cast them into the pit of destruction, bloody and deceitful man that shall not obtain half their days, and I will trust in you." You're going to find that in Psalm 55, verse 23. Now I'm going to ask the question again. Are you walking in the error of Balaam? Jude wrote his letter to counter ungodly people who turn the grace of God into lawlessness, which deny Yeshua. Jude reinforced his messages by applying teachings from the Torah, and that is the context of this verse of Jude. Balaam's error was to compromise with the world for profit. Gain that comes through this means is acquired through one's willingness to compromise the principles of God and proclaim things contrary to the revealed Word of God. That is the basis of the error of Balaam. And it's this error of Balaam was that he reasoned from the natural. He thought God would see matters the same way he saw them. And it made sense to him that if Israel was doing wrong, then God would want him to curse them. But he failed to recognize God's great love for his people. And he is that long-suffering towards you. Many still follow after the error of Balaam in thinking that God should act as they would act. They think that it's up to man to come to God, when in reality it was God who came to men at the cross. The next question is, are you walking in the doctrine of Balaam? In Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, it reads, "Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You people who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin," here's the sin, "by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality." Now, what is the context of this verse? The early Gothics practiced decadence as a principle since they believed that they were not under the law but under grace. And they taught this doctrine to other people, and it became known as the Doctrine of Balaam. But it also, in Revelation chapter 2, verse 15, which is the very next verse, it was also known as the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Teaching others to corrupt God's people is just as wrong as doing it yourself. And this was the doctrine. This was the teaching of Balaam. The doctrine of Balaam, spoken in Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, is an allusion that through the teachings of Balaam, Balak learned the way in which Israelites might be led into sin. Balaam showed Balak how to set a trap for the Israelites by enticing them into the double sin of idolatry and fornication, which often go together, and they still do. That's what he did. Now, the effect of this is recorded in Numbers chapter 25, verse 1. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the man began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women. To bring down the people of Israel, Balaam resorted to teaching. And by his teaching, God was bound by his own word to curse the people if they intermarried or if they offered to idols. Balaam, by attacking Israel indirectly with the Moabite women, received his reward. But guess what? As said before, he did not live to spend it. The Moabite women extracted a price for their services. They refused to have anything to do with the Jewish men until they had worshipped their god, Baal Peor. Now, again, are you walking in the doctrine of Balaam? Do you recall Balaam's procedure for building an altar and offering the sacrifices before each attempt to curse Israel? Balaam thought that a few choice offerings would appease God in such a manner that he would allow Balaam to curse Israel. And here again we find a misunderstanding of the offerings. Balaam thought that God would be handled in a mechanical manner. That means you can achieve any result you want with God by pumping in enough offerings. It's sort of like today how much money works with men by pumping money into the offerings. Balaam's understanding was that God is primarily interested in the offerings, and for enough offerings, God would be willing to bend a few rules. Don't believe it. Numbers chapter 31, verse 16 says, Behold, these called the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to commit trespass against the Lord in the manner of Peor, and there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. This doctrine of Balaam practice continues today with people who seek to compromise with the world and encourage unrighteousness among the believers. You can teach a person to sin or walk a holy life in three ways. You do it by the example you set, you do it by the words you use, and you do it by the things you approve of. Now, this pattern always begins with the way that leads to an error and finally accumulates into a doctrine that destroys the man. The way of Balaam led to the error of Balaam, which sealed his doom with the doctrine of Balaam. Now, what does this teach? Permission doesn't carry approval, nor does it imply blessing. Power does not imply right, and opportunity doesn't bring sanction. So, what did we learn from this particular portion? 4 lessons. Lesson number 1, when God asks you to do something, he's looking for absolute obedience. Believe it. Lesson number 2, when we get out of God's will, he will often put roadblocks in the way to get our attention. Sound familiar? Lesson number 3, when God puts a roadblock in your path, don't give someone else a beating for it. How's that grab you? Lesson number 4, Once you recognize your mistake, do three things. Humble yourself, as was recorded in Numbers chapter 22, verse 31. The second is to ask forgiveness of those you have hurt, as recorded in Numbers chapter 22, verse 33. And the next one is repent, Numbers chapter 22, verse 34. And then, the next time around, don't be so bullheaded, okay? Now, in this particular portion, there's also what was called the Haftorah. The Haftorah was recorded in Micah, and what we're reading now is Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? How do you walk humbly with your God? Two ways. First one is as a servant. Only one time is a believer in the Messiah called a Christian, but he or she is referred to as a servant a total of 85 times in the Brit Hadashah, if you're connecting it with the King James Bible. In Hebrew, the word servant, ebed, contains at least two key ingredients. Number one is action. That's the servant as a worker. Number two is obedience. It means that the servant can exercise no will or no initiative on his or her own. That's the first attribute. What's the second? By faith. Your attitude is what keeps you from becoming a works program. And the reason why is because Torah, believe it or not, is not of faith. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, it reads, Now that no man is justified by the law, by the Torah, by God's instruction before God is evident. For the righteous shall live by faith, and the law is not of faith. But he that does them, the law shall live in them. Obedience flows out of faith. It flows out of it. By faith, having faith, obedience flows out. In Romans chapter 1, verse 17, it says that you go from faith to faith. What this shows is a progression. And if there's a progression, you can go up and you can go down. Now, here's something. Remember the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner? I loved that movie. I really did. In that movie, Yul Brynner, who played the part of the Pharaoh, had a line that explained his attitude. The line was, so let it be written, so let it be done. Let's go through that question and answer one more time. What does the Lord require of you? The answer, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And to that I say, so let it be written, and so let it be done. And what will be your result? In Isaiah chapter 35, verses 8 to 10 in the Amplified, it reads this. And a highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The clean, unclean shall not pass over it, but us shall be for the redeemed. The way for a man, yes, the simple ones and fools shall not err in it and lose their way. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk on it. And the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing, and everlasting joy shall be upon their heads, and they shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. And with that I say, Shabbat Shalom. Have a fantastic week, and what we're going to do is the Aaronic benediction.